Okay, so today we're going to dive into something uh, pretty heavy hitting, this idea of weaponization of the federal government.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic right now.
It is. And, you send over a bunch of stuff for us to look at YouTube transcripts of congressional hearings, some presidential speeches. We even have some pretty in depth written analyses.
Yeah, real mixed bag.
Yeah, and our goal, I think, in this deep dive is to kind of try to sift through all of that and understand, the different perspectives that are out there and really kind of boil it down to, okay, what are the big takeaways? What are the most important insights here for our listeners?
Definitely, yeah, trying to cut through the noise.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So, why don't we start with the congressional hearing of the Weaponization Committee?
Hmm.
Right off the bat, the big thing that jumps out is this idea that the federal government is intentionally targeting political opponents and trying to silence viewpoints that don't align with the current administration.
Right, and that strikes at the very core of a democratic system,
Hmm.
right? The idea that the government should be operating without bias.
Absolutely. And they brought up some really specific areas of concern in this hearing. One of the major ones was this alleged coordination between all these different federal bodies, the White House, the State Department, the Surgeon General, even CISA.
CC?
Yeah, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agencies. This is a federal body that's supposed to be protecting our nation's critical infrastructure.
Right, cybersecurity.
Exactly. But the concern here is that they were allegedly involved, along with these groups called the Election Integrity Partnership and the Virality Project, in monitoring and potentially censoring online speech, which some argue is way beyond their traditional role.
Right, and it's this question of, okay, how far should the government go in trying to shape online discourse?
Yeah.
One side sees it as like, hey, this is necessary to combat misinformation, and the other side sees it as, a dangerous step towards censorship.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about, broad surveillance efforts. They were also saying that federal officials were actually influencing the content moderation policies of these big social media platforms, like directly pressuring them to ban or suppress viewpoints that the government didn't like. And the argument is that this has totally changed the way we communicate online,
Yeah.
making entire perspectives like virtually unspeakable on these platforms, which are now seen as kind of essential public spaces.
It's interesting because, we have this ideal of free speech, but then we also have to deal with the realities of these online platforms where harmful content or inaccurate information can spread so quickly.
Right. And that tension was definitely there in the hearing because there were counter arguments and different perspectives.
I'm sure.
For example, someone brought up the case of Robert Bowers, who committed that horrific anti-Semitic attack. And his violence was actually linked to hate speech that he had posted on Gab,
Right.
which is a platform that Twitter had deplatformed.
Right. So they were saying that platforms should have the ability to moderate hate speech, which, it's a tough question. Because, how do you balance those two things, right? The concern about censorship versus the very real dangers of this kind of hate speech spreading online.
It's a tough one. And then there was this interesting point where they brought up a post by Mr. Kennedy that wasn't taken down.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so it kind of raised this question of, okay, well, if some controversial content is still allowed, then does that mean that the censorship isn't as widespread as some are claiming?
Yeah, are they picking and choosing what they censor?
Right. Is it just certain viewpoints that are being targeted?
Right. And maybe it's not even about like silencing every dissenting voice,
Yeah.
but more about, creating this chilling effect where people are afraid to speak out in the first place
Right.
because they're worried about getting censored.
That's a good point. And then the discussion kind of shifted to, okay, what types of speech are we even talking about here? And there was a lot of criticism of the decision to let Mr. Kennedy speak at all.
Why is that?
Well, they specifically mentioned this video that he promoted comparing COVID vaccines to the Tuskegee trials.
Yeah.
And the argument was that, this kind of comparison is really irresponsible.
Yeah.
Especially, given the painful history of the Tuskegee trials for the Black community.
Right. Using that to discourage people from getting vaccinated today.
Exactly. And then Mr. Kennedy himself spoke, and he actually talked about his own experiences with censorship.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he claimed that his views on natural immunity being better than vaccine-induced immunity were suppressed, even when he was citing information from Bloomberg.
Wow.
And he basically said that the term misinformation has become a way to just dismiss anything that doesn't agree with the government orthodoxies.
So, this raises the question of who gets to decide what is misinformation, right?
Exactly. And he went so far as to say that trusting the experts is like religion, and totalitarianism.
That's pretty extreme.
Yeah, which of course got a strong reaction. But you know, it's interesting because he's highlighting this tension between skepticism of authority and, blindly accepting what the experts say.
Right.
On the other side, the ranking member was really upset that Mr. Kennedy was even allowed to speak, citing his past controversial statements about COVID-19, like the idea that it might disproportionately affect certain racial groups, and even comparing COVID restrictions to Nazi Germany.
So, this really shows how divided people are on these issues.
Totally. And finally, they heard from a researcher who studies disinformation online, and she actually testified that she had received death threats because of the committee's investigations.
Wow.
Yeah. She said it was creating a chilling effect on experts in her field, and that the majority members of the committee were actually using it to promote conspiracy theories and bully researchers.
That's a serious accusation.
It is, and it really just shows how contentious this whole discussion is.
Definitely. So we've got, claims of censorship versus concerns about misinformation, accusations of government overreach, and then you have this whole debate about free speech and the role of experts and who gets to decide what is true.
It's a lot.
It is.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the congressional hearing of the House Judiciary Committee. This one focused specifically on allegations related to the FBI.
Okay, so moving from this bigger picture of government influence on speech to more specific claims about the FBI.
Exactly. And the main claim here was that the FBI is targeting people who are not politically correct and retaliating against whistleblowers.
So essentially using their power to go after people they don't agree with.
Right, and silencing anyone who tries to speak out against them from within the agency.
And that, could really undermine public trust in the FBI.
Absolutely. And they were even saying that the FBI is using its security clearance process to weed out conservatives and whistleblowers.
So if you're not deemed politically reliable, you can't get access to classified information.
Right. And they had some pretty specific examples of FBI investigators allegedly asking employees about their support for President Trump and their views on COVID vaccines.
Like during their security clearance interviews.
Yeah, and the implication being that, these personal political views were being factored into these decisions about whether someone could be trusted with classified information.
Which, is concerning because it suggests that maybe career professionals are being judged based on their political beliefs rather than their actual job performance.
Exactly. And then they brought up this case of Marcus Allen, who's an FBI whistleblower. And he claims he was basically railroaded during his security clearance investigation.
Like they were trying to get rid of him because he spoke out.
Exactly. He said they violated his due process rights.
So he wasn't given a fair chance to defend himself.
Right. And he actually testified at the hearing and talked about having his security clearance revoked for 3 years and the ongoing problems faced by other whistleblowers like Garrett O'Boyle. Yeah. And he basically said, I have no confidence that the FBI will rein in its own conduct.
So he's basically saying the FBI is out of control.
Pretty much. And then they brought up this document called Project 2025, which claims that the FBI has been captured by an unaccountable bureaucratic managerial class and radical left ideologues.
So this is kind of the counter narrative.
Right. It's this idea that the FBI has been infiltrated by the left.
And that they're trying to purge conservatives from the agency.
Exactly. And the document actually proposes a vast expansion of political appointees within the FBI.
Which is interesting because, that could potentially make the FBI even more politicized.
Right. It's like fighting fire with fire.
Exactly. But then we have to consider the testimony of Inspector General Horowitz, who also spoke at this hearing.
Right.
And he actually said that his office had not found any evidence of a pattern or practice of misusing the security clearance process to target conservatives or people based on their views on January 6th, their religious beliefs, or their status as military veterans.
So he's basically saying that there's no systemic bias within the FBI.
Right. And he even said that his office had received complaints from people on both sides of the political spectrum.
So it's not just conservatives who are feeling targeted.
Right.
But even with that, Mr. Allen concluded his testimony by saying that he considered the hearing his last act of service and issued a warning to the American people about the FBI.
So despite what the Inspector General said, he still believes that there's a serious problem.
Yeah, and he's basically putting his reputation on the line
Yeah.
to warn the public about what he sees as a very real threat.
That's pretty powerful.
It is. So we've got these conflicting accounts, right? Allegations of FBI misconduct versus the Inspector General's findings. It's hard to know what to make of it all.
It really is.
Okay, so let's move on to another really controversial aspect of this whole discussion, the Twitter files, and the broader question of government influence on content moderation.
Right. So now we're talking about how the government might be influencing what we see online.
Exactly. And the testimony of Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger, who are both journalists, is really central to this part of the story.
Right. They're the ones who broke the Twitter files story.
Exactly. And they're claiming that the federal government, including Democrat members of Congress and intelligence agencies like the FBI, were using Twitter and other social media companies to censor American citizens.
So basically, they're saying that the government was working behind the scenes to silence certain voices online.
Exactly. And they said that there was this constant and pervasive communication between Twitter and the FBI to the point where they suggested that Twitter was basically a subsidiary of the FBI before Elon Musk bought it.
Wow, a subsidiary of the FBI.
Yeah. And both Mr. Taibbi and Mr. Schellenberger talked about how they were personally named in an FTC consent decree.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which they felt was directly related to their reporting on the Twitter files.
So they're basically saying that the government was trying to punish them for exposing this.
Exactly. And then they introduced this concept of a censorship industrial complex. So they described it as this network of government-funded organizations like the Stanford Internet Observatory, the University of Washington, the Atlantic Council, NewsGuard, the Disinformation Index, and they claimed that these organizations were pressuring social media platforms to censor content that they labeled as disinformation.
So they're saying that it's not just the government directly, but also these organizations that are funded by the government.
Exactly. And they were worried about this kind of mission creep.
Mission creep.
Yeah, they said that, it started with efforts to counter terrorism, then it expanded to countering extremism, and now it's about countering simple misinformation.
So basically, they're saying that the government is constantly expanding its reach when it comes to controlling what we see and hear online.
Right, and they brought up the Aspen Digital Hack and Dump Working Group exercise.
What was that about?
It was this scenario they were playing out about what would happen if a bunch of fake information about Hunter Biden was released online. And they pointed to the actions of Twitter and some mainstream media outlets, as well as a letter signed by 51 former intelligence officials, as evidence that there was this coordinated effort to suppress this information.
So they're saying that the government and the media were working together to control the narrative.
Exactly. And Mr. Schellenberger also talked about this report from the Stanford Cyber Policy Institute that seemed to suggest that journalists should abandon the Pentagon Papers principle.
Which is the idea that, sometimes it's in the public interest to publish leaked classified information.
Right. And then they brought up the issue of COVID-19 and how information about natural immunity was supposedly censored by the CDC and Twitter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, potentially because of pressure from pharmaceutical companies and, the government's own narrative about vaccines.
So they're saying that the government might have been downplaying information about natural immunity in order to push vaccines.
Right. And they also pointed to the Virality Project at Stanford, which allegedly discussed censoring true vaccine side effects and other true stories that might make people hesitant to get vaccinated.
So even if the information was true, they were still considering censoring it.
Right, because they felt like it was harmful to the public health message.
Wow.
And finally, they alleged that the Election Integrity Partnership at Stanford was disproportionately targeting disinformation coming from the right compared to the left.
So they're saying there's a partisan bias in how these organizations are deciding what to censor.
Exactly. But of course, Mr. Taibbi and Mr. Schellenberger also faced some pushback.
Yeah, I'm sure.
People questioned their sources and, the fact that they had this exclusive access to Twitter's internal communications, thanks to Elon Musk.
So people were suspicious of their motives.
Right. And there were also accusations that they were basically handpicked by Elon Musk, which some felt compromised their journalistic integrity.
It's like, whose side are they really on?
Right. And then, of course, they talked about the issue of hate speech on Twitter, like those really offensive tweets by Kanye West and whether those should have been taken down.
All right. So it's that same question of how do you balance free speech with the need to protect people from harmful content?
Exactly. And they also brought up the whole issue of Russian interference in elections.
Which is another very complex and controversial topic.
It is, but interestingly, there was some information presented suggesting that the FBI was actually careful not to explicitly tell Twitter what to do about the Hunter Biden story.
So maybe there wasn't as much direct interference as some people were claiming.
Right. But it's still kind of murky. How much influence did the FBI actually have?
Right.
So lots of unanswered questions there. And speaking of influence, let's talk about what President Trump had to say about all of this.
Okay, so shifting to the political side of things.
Right. We have this excerpt from a speech where he's talking about ending the weaponization of the federal government and restoring fair, equal, and impartial justice.
So he's acknowledging that this is a problem.
Yeah, and he said, never again will the immense power of the state be weaponized to persecute political opponents, something I know something about. We will not allow that to happen. It will not happen again.
So he's framing it as an attack on his own administration.
Exactly. And, it's interesting because he's echoing those same concerns that we heard in the congressional hearings and from the Twitter Files reporters.
Right, this idea that the government is being used as a weapon against its own citizens.
Exactly. And then there's this other piece of the puzzle, which is the Trump administration's offer of buyouts to federal workers and the requirement that remote employees had to return to the office or face termination.
Okay, so what was the thinking behind that?
Well, the union representing federal workers was pretty upset about it.
I can imagine.
They urged their members not to resign, and they basically said that the goal was to create a toxic environment and get rid of dedicated career civil servants, which they said would lead to chaos within federal agencies.
So they saw it as a deliberate attempt to dismantle the civil service.
Yeah, and it raises questions about what the Trump administration was really trying to do with the federal workforce.
Right, what was their agenda?
Exactly. And finally, you sent over some analyses related to the idea of ending the weaponization of the federal government. And these were kind of interesting because they were looking at the potential impact of an executive order on this topic, even though there wasn't a specific order mentioned in the transcripts.
So like a hypothetical executive order.
Exactly. And they used these frameworks called pestle and spear analyses to evaluate the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats associated with such an initiative.
It's kind of a big picture look at what might happen.
Right. And they highlighted potential strengths like increased public support for reducing political bias in the government, enhanced accountability through internal reviews and alignment with those constitutional principles of fairness.
So essentially creating a more transparent and accountable government.
Right. But they also pointed out weaknesses like potential resistance from within the agencies themselves. The fact that these kinds of audits and reforms would take a lot of time and resources, and the risk that people wouldn't comply because of the political climate.
So it wouldn't be easy to implement.
Definitely not. And they also identified opportunities like the potential to rebuild trust in the government, improve the efficiency of federal agencies, and maybe even set a good example for other countries.
So kind of a chance to really make a positive difference.
Exactly. But then there were the threats, like the risk that political divisions would get in the way the possibility of legal challenges to any reforms, and the worry that these efforts would be seen as partisan, which would just make things worse.
So a lot of potential pitfalls.
Yeah, and the analyses really emphasize the need for transparency, impartiality, accountability, and preventing this kind of abuse of power from happening again. But they also acknowledge that it would be a long and difficult process.
Right. It's not something that can be fixed overnight.
Yeah.
Definitely not. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's clear that this issue of the weaponization of the federal government is incredibly complex.
Yeah, there's so many different angles to it.
We've looked at allegations, counter-arguments, perspectives from all these different sources, and it's a lot to process.
It is. And I think it really highlights this fundamental question of, where do we draw the line between government power and individual freedom?
Absolutely. And, how do we ensure that the government is serving the people and not using its power against them?
Right. And that's a question that every generation has to grapple with.
Definitely. So for our listeners out there, we've thrown a lot of information at you, but hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this really important issue.
Yeah.
And, as you think about everything we've discussed, what do you see as the biggest threats to impartial governance and free speech today?
Right. What are the things that keep you up at night?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what questions do you have about the relationship between government technology and individual liberties? Because those are questions that are only going to become more important in the years to come.
Absolutely. So keep thinking about it, folks. This is a conversation that's not going away anytime soon.
Definitely not.